This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living Catholic, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor of Sacred Heart Parish and rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother. It seems we don't talk much about eternity, at least not as much as we used to. Perhaps it's not just very scientific, and we certainly don't want to be thought of as science's younger brother when it comes to relating to our people. Or maybe it's because we're so embroiled in the give and take of the politics of life that our imaginations just don't turn toward the fascination with eternity like our ancestors' imaginations did. Whatever the actual reason, it's certainly the case that the people I know don't mention the ultimates in life very often. I suspect that we in the church may shy away from such things because we've heard over the years the complaint that we've spent so much time looking at the sky, we've ignored the issues here in the dirt. At least that was a common thing to say all throughout the 20th century. By having people talk about heaven, we seem to be ill-equipped to deal with the intricacies of life that was changing and challenging the church everywhere. This was true enough, and not just from the church's enemies. Plenty of clergymen were impatient with the focus on eternity and the promises of heaven as they struggled to deal with the people in their charge. Over and over again, the church noted how many young, dedicated communists there were in nearly every society, spouting their complicated and intricate doctrines with unwavering commitment to the party. Our own missionaries paled in comparison to these young people who seemed willing to go to the death in their commitment to bring a new world into being. Every serious Latin American novel of the 1950s and 60s had a core of dedicated Marxists as characters who met to radicalize everyone they could find, at work and at school, sometimes at the threat of their own lives. And the church, at the same time, had a hard time finding anyone among these same people who would even go to Mass on Sunday. Too much time staring at heaven, not enough time in the slums. That seemed to be the outline of the proper complaint of every concerned clergyman of the times. In addition, the grave challenges facing the church didn't seem to resolve themselves in terms of the traditional language and themes of the past. After all, following World War II, one of the greatest transformations in human history began, a transformation of lifestyle and location that's still going on. From the mid-1940s on, the world migrated from the country into the city. We now live in a world in which, for the first time ever, more people are urban than rural. The displacements from the countryside and the interruption of family life and loyalties have made people strangers to one another, and the church a foreign element in people's lives. So many of the strategies of the past, successful in their time and place, seemed obsolete as the world morphed into a place no one had seen before. It seemed time to make a new stab at talking about God and grace. In the process, the concerns about heaven seemed tame. In a contest between the streets and the eternal home beyond the clouds, heaven lost. Besides, along with the movement into the cities, the general welfare of the entire world improved. Lifespans increased, the labor in industry was more well rewarded than the toil in the countryside, and the services and opportunities in city life became notably more mobile and much more hopeful for most people. And even when these promises for a greater share in life were not met, they did propel the imaginations of the world, so much so that many people were animated to embrace the prospect of the world here and now, and therefore left behind their concern for a world yet to come. Today, leading to the promises of tomorrow, seemed a lot more engaging than tomorrow leading to the summoning to eternity. The eternal seemed a lot less than it used to be. Mary Eberstadt has proposed that the interruption of family life has also contributed to this deficit in our practice. One aspect of urban life has been the devaluing of children in the structure of the family. On the farm and among the crops, a child is an asset whose aid is nearly immediate and whose contributions are immeasurable. In the urban landscape, a child is a burden and places a strain on the whole family. Progressing through the stages of life, the urban family must wait nearly an entire generation before there is any payout from the investment of time and money as a child becomes an adult. And much of the gain that will be realized is emotional and abstract rather than direct and proximate. And so, urban citizens stopped having children. And when this happens, Mary Eberstadt, the author, insists the link between the meaning of life and the energy of the future is ruptured. The consequence of this is the great forgetting that we have come to expect. We forget God, heaven, the meaning of life, and the future of our souls. While you don't have to agree with her assessment, you can't argue with the results. In our urban world, how many of the people do you know orient their lives toward the invitation to eternity? How many are tuned to the promises of the life to come rather than to the promises of what they have invested? If you talk to the same people I do, then you know not many. Oh, sure, churches pop up on nearly every corner like mushrooms after a spring rain. But the religion most popular is focused on problem solving and perspective taming rather than on a new orientation toward the eternal. At least it seems so to me. The Eberstadt thesis seems to be alive and well, especially among the big box churches all around us. We've forgotten. We're not exempt, of course, not we, Catholics. Nothing happens in the world that does not run down the middle of our hearts. Our talk about eternity is muted, and for all the same reasons as it is for everyone else. Most often, we're focused on the right now and on the close horizon, not on the long term or on the forever variables in the equations of life. When was the last time you heard a talk about, say, teenage sexuality, and someone mentioned to a young person the state of his soul or the ultimate meaning of his decisions in the life to come? My guess is never. And I know why. It's because such a theme would mean almost nothing to the persons who heard it. Our concern is about health and happiness, about safety and protection, about physiology and psychology, rather than about eternity and timelessness. Hearing someone advert to what we know nothing about is as off-putting as hearing a quote in another language. It might spark a moment of interest in its rhythm and its strangeness, but it won't move anybody. So we remain firmly stuck to the earth, which means our religious concerns are fixed to the curvature of the here and now. In response to our critics, we've seldom lifted our eyes to the heavens and asked others to do so. If we point upward, we're liable to limit our gaze to the middle distance and wonder what it would be like to get there in place of imagining the great beyond lying at the end of our wondering and our wondering. That is, and the presumption on everyone's part that the gift of eternity is deeded to everyone. The placid Elysian fields of the future is simply the destiny of every soul, and no one is much anxious about what might be required to arrive there beyond the unpleasantry of dying. That's what most people believe. I've almost never met anyone who wasn't already convinced that his personal future didn't stretch into the intricacies of eternity without concern. Well, to be more precise, I've almost never met anyone who carried with him a lot of concern about the ultimate moment of stepping into the eternal. Rather than the moment of great aloneness as we stand naked before the truth of ourselves and the future of revelation, most people seem to regard the final step into the great beyond as simply the slide into the refreshing bath at the end of his personal history. Most people, it seems, are pretty unconcerned about it all. Even those who evince some anxiety seem mostly to speak of it in terms of some faltering in personal growth, rather than the ultimate judgment awaiting them. About 30 years ago, the movie The Priest encapsulated the moment well. A young priest, just out of the seminary and newly assigned to his parish, has just finished a wake service for a well-known parishioner. The whole thing takes place at a pub, the one at which the deceased was well familiar. At the end of some reminiscing from his friends, everyone bows his head in a moment of silence. The young priest then interjects to tell everyone that if they want to go to confession, he'll be in the back room off the main bar. There's a pregnant pause, and then everyone bursts out laughing. No one in the crowd can imagine anyone would have anything to confess, at least not in the sense of unburdening themselves or of being reconciled. They're content to remember their friend in the concourse of his life as they return to the complicated contortions of their own lives. Being made ready or being made new are foreign concepts. The priest sits in the room alone. After a while, he comes out and has a glass of beer with the boys and then looks at the boisterous crowd. He who focuses on the future becomes the stranger to everyone. We might also note, in the face of our critics, that our step away from staring at the clouds has produced none of the same fanaticisms and commitments so evident in the revolutionaries in our midst. Those who are radicalized are ready to throw themselves into the pyre of societal change for the good of everyone, and they seem to be everywhere. While the number of those who are ready to follow the footsteps of Christ, who promised new life to all who find him, seem to be as small as ever before. I recently wrote of my encounter with a young woman who has committed herself to the great goal of ending oil by 2030. It's an ambitious commitment that will be met by no one, including herself. But despite its ambiguity and unrealizable future, she's committed. In fact, I suspect she has no real plans to ensure its embodiment. I know her, and I know she's never even faced the prospect of, or even imagined, living a summer in Oklahoma without air conditioning. But all her deficits to the side, she defines her life according to this commitment, and she finds meaning and community with others by giving herself to it. All the other parts of her life are judged by this definition of herself and of her group. Talking to her is actually a kind of bracing contact with an amazing level of energy and a startling jolt of commitment. And by the way, she is the product of 12 years of Catholic education, which she has abjured completely in favor of her new vows to end oil by 2030. She's all for the future, whatever or wherever the next 5 years or 50 might take her. At least she's all for the future for 5 years, for now. But there has to be something to eternity. Whether it's a religious concept or not, the structure of our consciousness and the realities of our world prompt us to think in this direction. At least once in a while, we owe it to ourselves to turn our minds toward the wholeness that lies beyond the right now. Who can make it through the night thinking only of tomorrow or next year, or when retirement comes? Everyone has wondered what might lie beyond us all, no matter how thoroughly he might have repressed it. Eternity, in its faintest flickering images, is still compelling enough and real enough to spend some time conjecturing about. Here are a few aspects we have to consider. The first is the most obvious. Eternity is a long time. All of us know that once we turn, say, 50, the length of our days we're given is as nothing. The years pile up more quickly than we can imagine, and the decades fly by before we know it. At age 40, we reach the midlife crisis when we begin to imagine the taint of mortality on our soul. Arriving to 50, 10 years later, if we've noticed nothing else, we have to take into account the fact that those years, those 10 years, have passed by in a flash. And after, what will be? Walk through a cemetery sometime and look at the grave markers there. All of them detail the names and dates of the ones who lie there, all of whom were just like us. Many of them lived lives longer than the lives we're living now, and yet there they lie. What's to come of us in the great abyss of years after us? The sum of what comes after us is vastly greater than the sum we can accumulate of ourselves. Eternity is forever. The years we have now, no matter how engaging they are or totalizing they've been, are as nothing compared to the years to come. Again, think of those names cut into the gravestones. Each of them is a person whose worries and anxieties filled their lives. They were concerned about their success, and they paced the floor because of their failures. The entire progression of their lives, from being a tiny baby to becoming an old codger, is now detailed in the dates under their names. And they're all gone. What life meant and how they passed it has now all passed away with them. Eternity has the power to transvalue all their values. Recently, a podcaster was describing his advice to young men who feel frustrated in their lives. He said that he constantly reminds these young men that Bill Gates and Warren Buffett would exchange their billions of dollars with any young man who's now 20 years old, no matter how depressing or unfavorable that young man's circumstances were. They would do anything to have the time, to have the ultimate resource these young men have, which is the future open before them. But these men of means have lived their lives. Now, for them, the beyond awaits. The purpose of their lives is something beyond their billions, and they know it. The next realization is that when we think of the eternal, we participate in some measure with the divine. This isn't always agreeable to our secular world, whose formal belief is that this right here and right now is all there is. But no one actually believes that to be true. The very nature of consciousness is constantly questing. To think is to run our imagination out beyond the boundaries of what we know, and that pursuit of what to know is endless. Father Karl Rahner called it the transcendent horizon. If there is an eternity, and it seems we're built to be in it, then whatever God is going to be part of it. So the conclusion is obvious. If we're there and God is, then we and God will have something to do with one another. This, again, isn't very scientific. At least the scientists tell us fairly often they don't believe in God. At least they tell us they don't believe in what can't be proven or can't be demonstrated. But of course, scientists believe all kinds of transcendent things that can't be proven. They believe that numbers have the utility of describing reality. Although no one knows how or why or whether it will always be true, that they do. They believe there is the capacity to know truth, and that what we can know is congruent with what there is in the world to know. There seems to be laws that govern the operation of the universe, although whether these are simply the product of our imaginations and the exterior product of our interior processes, they don't know. But they continue to discover and believe in these laws, although they can't explain where they come from. And on and on. Science operates only because there is a fundamental and unprovable belief that there is a world and it operates according to ordered systems and it can be known. We can get away with our own beliefs and still be at ease with the scientists among us who believe in things that can't be proven. If it is the case that the overwhelming tower of eternity casts a shadow over the puny years that we can accumulate during our lifetimes, then any of the stair steps to eternity are more valuable than just about anything else. If there can be a gateway into an experience or an understanding of eternal life, then it only seems reasonable that that gateway would be just about the most purposeful bit of real estate anyone could describe. It may be true that we slide into the eternal beyond as a mere consequence of our living, but if we are oriented toward it, if we take it into account as part of our living, then our lives will certainly be more cogent, more congruent, and more purposeful than denying there is such a thing or such a possibility. It's a simple proposition. If there is an eternity and we're going to be a part of it, then it would be better to be prepared. Certainly we know being unprepared would seem to be against everything we know about our lives. Another aspect of our leaning into the presence of eternity is how much it seems to be in our nature. That is, in the course of humanity, just about everyone has stared at the truth of the abyss and has come up with answers for its challenge. For some, there is the rough project of reincarnation. For some, there is the place of the dead where we all wait until the fullest completion of the human project is over. For others, there is the eternal reward as the natural prospect of a life well lived. And, of course, for still others, there's the punishment of hell in store for those whose lives were not well lived. It seems that we had to wait for modernity to come across the angry prospect that our lives are simply snuffed out as a candle, with no more consequence than light being overcome by darkness. In the ancient world, even animals were attributed spirits that moved among the world with the power of life to continue and to influence. Whatever the absolute truth of the world to come is, we are built to embrace it. At the very minimum, it seems natural to lean into the eternal. We believe, of course, that our lives are not merely accidents of nature. Rather than tripping into the scenery of the world, our lives are guided by the hand of God toward the ultimate divine will. Since this is so, our lives are guided toward the truths of eternity and all of the fullness there is to find there. In fact, we believe that the real measure of life is not measured by these few years that pass by so quickly, but that the ultimate truth is played out in time. Actually, our belief is much more comprehensive and much more powerful than simply believing in the progress of time, beginning with the creation of the universe and then continuing into the endlessness of eternity. We believe that eternity is not the reward given to good people. It's simply the definition of what our lives are. We are pitched toward eternal life as a result of living. And since we are, we can either live well or we can live poorly. The fullness of life flowering into all joy like a plant greening in the sun, or the stunted possibility of life with all faculties faltering and fading like a lawn in an Oklahoma summer drought. The great hope given to us is that we can prepare to truly live and to live now. This has immense consequences in the here and now. Since our lives are pointed toward eternity, all that is eternal should be cultivated in us. Truth and beauty, the pursuit of the good, faithfulness and honor, the gift of revelation and the fullness of being, all of these attributes prepare us for an eternity in which our being opens to light and joy. Negating them closes us off from the joy of eternity in front of us. While we don't have time to go into the intricacies of heaven and hell, we might remember the admonition of C.S. Lewis when describing eternal damnation. He said, "Remember, all the doors in hell are locked from the inside." Preparing ourselves to receive the gift of eternity, that's the meaning of the life of the believer. And I'll end with one other observation. It should be obvious to those who look, but it has so far escaped us. Eternity and the focus on the eternal produces beauty. When the prospect of the transcendent is cut short and the endless is shortchanged, the product is dissolution, destruction, and ugliness. Contrast the obstetric wing of a hospital with an abortion clinic. Compare a garden to a parking lot, a farm pasture to a playing field's astroturf, a school to a concentration camp. In the Middle Ages, the craftsmen and architects were convinced their world was defined by the limitation of years and the miserably small indent of human striving. Their lives were measured by their insignificance and their service to the grandeur of God. And yet, in their focus on God, they brought forth the greatest architectural achievements yet accomplished in the world when they built their cathedrals. Those who brought their eyes lower and focused no farther than the horizon or bypassed heaven when they looked at the stars have never been able to match what those men did. Eternity has the power to create what is timeless. We only have to look around to see it. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called, "It's Not the Heat." It's not the heat, not really, as the days ascend to the high numbers. It's the streets, really, and the rising convection that encumbers. Our minds and our appreciation of what we were seeing would not bind us in our initiation into our summer being. Were we to stand in a stubble field to greet the rising temps, the thermometer's band would quickly yield and all our guff go limp. As in so many things we don't see well, are blinded by what we expect. 1,000 measures fling their very selves as our senses inspect and measure what we know and bring us the world in sight. Rather than to let it flow, it sings to us amid all the heat and light. So be calm this season at these numbers we see every day. There is a reason we slowly lumber in our set, defined ways. We're just not used to understanding what it is we're seeing. Our sense of self is bruised as we're handling the truth that is freeing. It's not the heat. I hope you join us in the weeks to come here at Living Catholic.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.